She wanted my cabin, she wanted my weekend, and somehow, she acted like both belonged to her. I didn't even know the woman and never laid eyes on her before, but she insisted the hoe had approved her stay. When I laughed at the idea, she warned me I'd regret that reaction. I've had my fair share of unusual neighbors, but this was something different. She carried paperwork. She brought backup. She radiated confidence, like she'd practiced this exact confrontation in front of a mirror 100 times. And when things fell apart, it ended with flashing blue lights in my driveway and her screaming my name like we were locked in some personal feud. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Not even close. Have you ever dealt with someone this brazen? Let me know. Because I thought moving to the lake meant peace and quiet. I believed that dream for all of 48 hours. That's how long it took for our new lakeside cabin to shift from dream retirement to a property management nightmare. I should introduce myself. I'm Grant. I've run my own auto shop longer than I care to admit. Drop a comment about where you're tuning in from. I'm honestly curious if your neighborhoods harbor characters like the one we met here. When we arrived, moving boxes cluttered the porch. Emily, with her usual precision, was already organizing things while I worked on setting up a garage space in the back. The moving truck hadn't even cleared the road when I heard footsteps coming toward us. Steady, purposeful. That should have been my first clue, but I was too focused on arranging my tools. By the time I wiped the grease from my hands and looked up, she was standing there. Pam Weston. She carried herself like the whole neighborhood fell under her command. Her posture, her stare. She made our yard feel smaller just by being in it. A clipboard was clutched in one hand like it was some badge of office, and in the other, her phone already live streaming me to whoever was watching. She announced, loud enough for the breeze to carry it across the yard, "Everyone in this lakeside community is required to join the HOA." Her voice reminded me of the customers who walk into my shop convinced they know more about engines than I do after decades in the trade. I tossed the rag onto my workbench and walked over, already sensing the pushy sales pitch coming. Emily looked up from the box she was unpacking and answered with calm professionalism, "We'd need to review the paperwork first." Her expression told me she was already dissecting the situation. That's just who she is, detail-oriented, especially when it comes to anything involving contracts or compliance. Pam's smile was all surface, never reaching her eyes. She handed over a thick stack of documents, pointing out sections about fees, rules, and proper maintenance standards. While she rambled on about neighborhood expectations, my eyes drifted toward the lake path, where I noticed a weathered old sign, half hidden in weeds. The faded words were clear enough: "Lake maintained by state parks." Pam must have seen my attention wandering, because she cut in with something oddly specific. "You've had code violations piling up since May, haven't you?" That stopped me. How could she possibly know that? I'm no legal expert, but even I knew something about her statement didn't add up. If this hoe really had jurisdiction, why would the state still claim responsibility for the lake? I made a note to run it past Emily Ladderer. She's far sharper with legal details than I am. Pam kept up her spiel, but I couldn't stop thinking about that sign. If the state maintained the lake, what business did this hoe have dictating access? She eventually shifted her attention to my garage setup, criticizing it with a tone that suggested I'd failed some invisible inspection. I bit back the first response that came to Minda, that my garage had met plenty of standards without HOA approval for decades, and instead gave a diplomatic nod. I told her we'd review the documents. Meanwhile, Emily quietly snapped photos of every page, already preparing for a proper legal review. Pam caught her doing it and made a comment that sounded like a warning wrapped in neighborly advice. "Most people find cooperation easier than resistance." At the time, it just came across as smug. Looking back, I recognize it for what it was: a threat. Once Pam finally left, Emily and I spread the stack across our kitchen table. The so-called HOA fees were outrageous, far beyond anything we'd planned for. The rules were suffocating. Restrictions on what vehicles could sit in the driveway, fixed schedules for lawn care, even guidelines on what counted as acceptable outdoor activities. One section about lake access jumped out at me. According to the documents, membership was mandatory for swimming, fishing, or even walking along the shoreline. That didn't match what I saw earlier. If the state maintained the lake, then public access should be guaranteed, a HOA or no HOA. I pointed this out to Emily, and she immediately agreed. We needed to dig deeper into property rights and management authority before signing anything. It felt less like moving into a new home and more like stepping straight into some power struggle we didn't yet understand. That night, as we tried to settle into our new routine, things took a darker turn. Our doorbell camera captured something unsettling. Around 9:30, someone approached our mailbox. The motion sensor kicked on, recording just enough to show a clipboard hitting the ground, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps retreating into the dark. The doorbell camera caught Ida hands rummaging through our personal mail before vanishing back into the dark. The footage wasn't crystal clear, but the movements left no doubt. This wasn't curiosity about new neighbors, it was a deliberate search through our correspondence. When I showed Emily the recording, her eyes narrowed with that same sharp focus she gets when she's analyzing wrongdoing. We'd been in this neighborhood for just one day, and already someone was going through our private mail. The clipboard left behind could have belonged to anyone, but after Pam's earlier visit and her comment about cooperation versus resistance, the timing felt far too pointed to dismiss. I couldn't tell if I was being overly suspicious or if my gut was right that we'd just stumbled into something much larger than a nosy neighbor. Either way, our peaceful lakeside dream was already cracking. The very next morning, things escalated. Instead of waking up to the sound of birds on the water, I opened the door to find our property plastered with paperwork. Official-looking violation notices were taped to the mailbox, the front door, my garage entrance, even tucked under my windshield wipers. We'd only lived here 3 days. 3 days, yet somehow, we'd already failed community standards. I stood there with my coffee in hand, tearing them down one by one, half in disbelief and half in frustration. How had Pan managed to find so many violations in such a short time? Looking back, I should have realized this was only her opening move. Emily joined me outside, still in pajamas, and we spread the papers out on the kitchen table. 2 main accusations: mechanical tools visible from the street and grass below acceptable community standards. That last one stopped me cold. The lawn hadn't even had time to grow since we moved in. Either Pam was inventing violations or her standards were impossibly absurd. Emily shook her head and pointed out that my garage setup was completely ordinary for any residential area. I wanted to stay calm, but honestly, who wouldn't lose patience at such obvious harassment? What struck me most was Pam's performance. She wasn't just documenting these violations, she was live-streaming the entire process, talking into her phone like a host educating the audience on how to handle difficult new residents. From the kitchen window, I caught glimpses of her theatrics. It wasn't enforcement, it was humiliation. She wasn't trying to resolve anything, she was turning us into a spectacle for content. And that stung worse than the violations themselves, because it felt designed to shame us in front of neighbors we hadn't even met yet. I couldn't help but wonder, was this how she treated every newcomer, or was Emily and I being singled out? My answer came in the form of something far more sinister. While inspecting my truck, I found industrial-grade staples embedded deep into the side wall of one of the tires. Not road debris, not an accident, a deliberate act of sabotage. I've been in the automotive world long enough to recognize intentional damage, and this was it. Someone had used professional tools to compromise my vehicle. That changed everything. This wasn't just about harassment with paperwork anymore, this was criminal destruction of property. Pam's tactics shifted again. Instead of scattering notices, she sent out a mass email to every resident in the community. The subject line read, "Lakeside newcomers need community guidance." She never named us outright, but the tone was unmistakable. We were being painted as troublemakers, disrupting community harmony. It was vague enough to avoid legal blowback, but sharp enough to make neighbors suspicious. It was social pressure warfare, plain and simply turn the entire neighborhood against us before we even had a chance to introduce ourselves. And then came the sign, a fresh warning posted at the lake access trail. Non-members risk immediate loss of all lake privileges pending compliance review. That was the first direct threat about excluding us from the amenities we'd moved here to enjoy. It made me think back to that faded state park sign I'd spotted on day one. If the state maintained the lake, then Pam's claim to authority was built on sand. Emily agreed we needed to dig into ownership records and find out who truly controlled this land. But while Pam was busy performing for her live stream, something slipped through that she clearly hadn't meant to share. The camera caught a glimpse of paperwork she was holding. On it were bank routing numbers. I recognized them immediately as they weren't connected to any institutional or HOA account. They looked like personal checking numbers. That raised an entirely different red flag. Was Pam running a fake HOA? Before I could process that fully, things got even stranger. Over the weekend, a tow truck started circling our street, not once or twice, several times. At all hours, it would slow in front of our driveway, linger near our vehicles, then speed off the moment I stepped outside. It wasn't random curiosity, it was surveillance. Coordinated, persistent. I started documenting everything with my phone, and our cameras confirmed I did the same truck, same driver, looping around at different times, always slowing to scope us out. This wasn't casual harassment anymore. This was organized, targeted. And it meant Pam's campaign wasn't just some neighborly power trip, it was something planned, deliberate, and escalating. Emily suggested we keep detailed records of every incident. At this point, it was clear, legal action wasn't just a possibility, it was becoming inevitable. And for the first time since we bought this cabin, I caught myself thinking maybe we'd made a mistake moving here at all. The retreat we'd dreamed of was unraveling, turning into something that felt more like a battlefield than a home. And we hadn't even finished unpacking. Still, something about Pam's actions gnawed at me. It wasn't just about control or petty harassment. Her behavior felt frantic, like she was racing to assert authority for reasons that went deeper than any ordinary HOA dispute. Was our presence somehow threatening her grip on power? Or was this simply how she treated anyone who didn't immediately bow to her rules? That night, I heard faint scratching near the back fence. Too heavy for an animal, a shadow shifted in the dark and disappeared. By morning, our water supply was mysteriously shut off. On Tuesday, Emily and I attended a community meeting at the local center. The room was arranged like a courtroom of folding chairs in neat rows facing a long table where Pam sat waiting. Beside her was a man I didn't recognize, who introduced himself as Alan Harper, a documentation specialist. His smug confidence put me on edge immediately. When I asked what kind of law he practiced, he sidestepped neatly, saying he handled compliance paperwork and regulatory matters. That should have been my first major warning sign, but my attention was fixed on the mountain of contracts spread across the table like ammunition. Alan began his presentation using sample forms displayed on a small projector. It didn't take long for me to spot something odd. The logos and letterheads weren't local. They came from all over Texas, California, even Florida. These weren't official documents for our state, they were generic forms scraped from the internet, sloppily rebranded with our community's name stamped on top. I may not be a lawyer, but even I could see how amateur and possibly fraudulent this was. Emily scribbled notes quietly, her eyebrows climbing higher with every inconsistency Alan skimmed over. I could tell she was already piecing together how wrong this all felt. Was Alan actually a legal professional, or just another actor in Pam's ongoing performance? As he shuffled papers across the table, I noticed a small lapel pin on his jacket. The design matched the emblem Pam had been using on her letterhead. Not a coincidence. I kept quiet, but suspicion twisted in my gut. Alan wasn't independent. He was part of Pam's machinery. Then came the handouts. Alan distributed contracts featuring QR codes, supposedly linking to HOA financial records and bylaws. Emily scanned one with her phone. Instead of community records, it directed her straight to a personal PayPal account labeled Stan.com Community. Pam's name, her account. Even I knew that was wildly inappropriate. Legitimate HOAs use business banking, not casual payment taps. Alan noticed Emily scanning the link and stumbled over an excuse, promising those technical details would be updated later. His nervous shuffling of papers told me he knew they'd been caught. Pam quickly pivoted. Instead of talking about violations, she announced a new initiative, Lakeside Maintenance Volunteers. Her pitch made it sound like community service, but the subtext was obvious. It was punishment, especially for problem residents who hadn't shown proper cooperation. In other words, us. These volunteer duties included cleaning common areas, clearing trails, and performing administrative work under Pam's supervision. Community service disguised as obligation. And then Alan played his role. Subtly, he started whispering doubts about Emily's career background to other attendees. He never made outright accusations, just vague suggestions that her work history might not align with community values. The kind of whisper campaign meant to plant seeds of distrust. Anger boiled in me, but I kept my voice steady. Funny how rumors spread before anyone bothers to ask for facts. Alan's forced smile cracked just slightly, enough to tell me he hadn't expected pushback. From there, the room shifted. Families who had greeted us politely days earlier now avoided eye contact. People shifted seats, leaving space between us. It wasn't spontaneous, it was orchestrated. Pam had already been poisoning the well, and now the meeting gave her an audience to amplify it. When Alan was pressed about his legal credentials, he got slippery. He tossed around vague phrases like regulatory advisory and compliance consulting, but avoided naming a single law firm or institution. His business card looked polished, but it listed nothing beyond a phone number and email address. No office, no company, nothing verifiable. Emily asked sharper questions about his bar admission. Alan squirmed, then changed the subject. Even his financial paperwork raised alarms. Years of reviewing auto shop invoices had trained me to spot irregularities, and these documents were full of them. Some followed corporate accounting formats, others looked like they'd been designed for personal tax filings. Fees shifted wildly between versions, suggesting none of this was standardized. The math itself didn't add up. Maintenance costs were inflated well beyond what our small community amenities could possibly justify. When residents pressed Alan with simple legal questions, basic things about HOA authority or property rights, he stumbled. He didn't understand governing structures or state regulations. Instead, he leaned on jargon and dodges, the kind of bluffing I'd seen countless customers use when pretending to understand car problems they clearly didn't. This man wasn't qualified, not even close. The meeting ended with Pam distributing invitations to something she called a resolution conference at the Lakeside Pavilion later in the week. The language was vague, but the message was clear. This was our last chance to resolve compliance issues before they moved on to serious enforcement. Emily and I exchanged a look. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than just Pam's ego. Emily and I exchanged a look that said it all. This wasn't about cooperation anymore. The so-called resolution conference was nothing more than a veiled ultimatum, a staged attempt to break us down with intimidation and manufactured authority. As we walked back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the realization that we were witnessing a fraud operation masquerading as neighborhood management. The sloppy templates, sketchy PayPal links, and Alan's hollow legal jargon weren't just red flags, if they were proof that the entire system Pam presented as official was built on deception. If this much was fabricated, how many of our neighbors had already been manipulated without even realizing it? Outside the cabin, Emily stopped and said quietly, "I need to make some calls." Her tone was heavier than usual, like she was switching gears into something more serious. That night, her evening jog changed everything between us and Pam. At first, the run around the lakeside trail seemed routine. I was inside skimming over papers when the low rumble of an SUV engine caught my attention. It idled outside our cabin longer than made sense. When I peeked through the window, I saw Pam's SUV crawling along the jogging path, shadowing Emily's run. Every time Emily paused, the vehicle stopped too. When she started again, Pam rolled forward at the same pace. It wasn't neighborhood watch. It was stalking. By the time Emily came back, her face told me something serious had gone down. She described how Pam intercepted her on the most isolated stretch of trail near the old boat dock. No houses nearby, no witnesses. Pam had stepped out of her vehicle and positioned herself in the middle of the path, cutting off Emily's way home. The conversation started predictably at complaints about us ignoring HOA rules. But when Emily held her ground, insisting on reviewing proper documentation before committing to anything, Pam escalated. She leaned on her car door just enough to make the pistol grip inside the console visible. She didn't point it, but the message was unmistakable. Her words were chilling. "I enforce compliance here. Respect comes one way or another, and I'm done waiting for you people to figure it out." It wasn't an overt threat of violence, But the implication was clear. She wanted Emily to know she had the means to back up her demands. The precision of it all, the timing, the isolated spot, the careful reveal made me realize this wasn't a spontaneous outburst. Pam had planned it. I clenched my jaw as Emily told me. We weren't dealing with an overbearing neighbor anymore. We were up against someone willing to use intimidation and a firearm to impose authority that didn't exist. My answer was immediate. We're not signing anything, and we're not bowing to threats. Emily agreed without hesitation. What struck me was how she reacted. Instead of panicking, she became methodical. She opened her laptop and began drafting a detailed incident report, complete with timestamps and GPS coordinates. Then she backed up her files to multiple encrypted cloud servers with a level of technical expertise that caught me off guard. When I asked about it, she simply said it was standard practice for documenting potential criminal behavior. It dawned on me that Emily had more experience with situations like this than I'd ever realized. As unsettling as Pam's threats were, Emily's composure shifted my perspective. She wasn't surprised by the escalation as she had prepared for it. We soon uncovered more evidence tying Pam directly to the harassment. The threatening note left on our cabin door matched the exact paper stock and printer ink used in the community meeting room. Either Pam was abusing HOA equipment for personal intimidation, or the entire operation was her own invention. Neither option looked good for her. Emily suggested we check the local convenience store's cameras near where Pam confronted her. The manager was helpful and confirmed the exterior cameras had footage of that stretch of trail. If the audio was clear, we might even capture Pam's threatening words as evidence far stronger than just our testimony. Pam's tactics were moving far beyond financial disputes. She was using fear calculated, escalating fear to establish dominance. It felt more like the behavior of an organized crime figure than a community coordinator. And the way she justified it to herself, as if she were upholding order instead of breaking the law, made her all the more dangerous. Later that evening, a text came through with perfect timing. Sunday, 5 p.m., Lake Dock. Final discussion. No name, no signature. But the imperious tone matched Pam's style exactly. The choice of meeting place at a remote dock far from houses or foot traffic wasn't a coincidence. Emily studied the message with a calm, analytical look. She wasn't thinking about surrendering, she was planning. I found myself checking window locks and door latches like we were in hostile territory instead of a lakeside neighborhood. Pam had taken us from paperwork harassment to stalking to displaying a weapon in a matter of days. But through it all, Emily's expression told me one thing: she had a plan. The only question was whether I was ready to follow her lead. I couldn't shake the thought that our quiet retreat was slipping further away with each step deeper into this conflict. Emily spent the next hour making encrypted phone calls, her voice low, her words coded in a way I couldn't follow. When she finally hung up, she looked at me with unsettling calm. "Sunday will be broken bar interesting," she said. By late afternoon, a tension thick enough to feel in the air hung over the community. Around 4:30, people had already started drifting toward the lake, gathering with the anticipation of an audience waiting for a show. From our window, I saw families carrying folding chairs, arranging themselves in clusters as though they'd been told where to stand. It was obvious Pam had orchestrated this moment, preparing both her stage and her spectators. Emily dressed with a precision that caught my attention. At first glance, her clothes looked casual, but something about the way she carried herself hinted at deliberate authority. She didn't look nervous, she looked prepared. As we walked toward the dock, I could feel every pair of eyes following us, measuring us. Pam stood at the center, clipboard clutched in her hand, her stance radiating self-assurance. The crowd gave us wide berth, creating a visible divide that felt engineered. When Emily finally spoke, it wasn't in anger, it was precise, calculated, and professional. She began questioning Pam about the legitimacy of her so-called HOA. She brought up incorporation requirements, state registrations, and fiduciary responsibilities with the kind of fluency that even surprised me. It didn't take long for the crowd to pick up on the cracks forming in Pam's performance. This wasn't the problem family Pam had painted us to be. This was someone who knew the law better than she did. Pam's agitation grew by the second. Rather than answering questions, she raised her voice, deflecting, and insisting that questioning her authority was disrespecting community values. The louder she got, the more her control slipped. When Emily pressed again for documentation, Pam finally snapped. That's when she made the mistake that destroyed her Section 8. Furious and cornered, she pulled a gun from her jacket, pointing it directly at Emily. "You either join this community," she shouted, "or you'll be cut out of it permanently." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Parents shielded their children. Neighbors fumbled for their phones. Pam had crossed the line from intimidation into outright armed assault, and she did it in front of dozens of witnesses. The gunshot shattered the moment Pam fired into the air, and chaos erupted. My instincts took over. I moved before the echo had faded, disarming her and locking her hands behind her back. She spat at me, demanding to know under whose authority. I showed her my badge. The sight of it stole the words from her mouth. Then Emily's voice cut through the panic. "Sheriff Emily Porter, drop your weapon." The command landed like thunder. The crowd froze, realizing in an instant that Pam hadn't just been bullying neighbors as she'd threatened a law enforcement officer. Pam's bravado dissolved into panic, her weapon wavering as reality caught up to her. Emily activated her phone, playing recordings of Pam's earlier threats. "I am the law here," echoed across the lake. Every person listening heard it for themselves. Her delusions, her intimidation, her willingness to enforce rules with a weapon. Phones captured it all from multiple angles. While Emily maintained control, I moved through the families, guiding them to safety behind the pavilion. Some parents rushed their kids away, others froze in disbelief, struggling to accept what they just witnessed. Within minutes, the wail of sirens grew louder. Deputies arrived, securing the scene and taking Pam into custody. Even as she was read her rights, she looked more bewildered than remorseful, as if she couldn't comprehend how quickly her power had evaporated. Neighbors stood in stunned silence. Slowly, some approached us with apologies. They admitted they'd paid Pam under pressure, fearing they'd lose access to community privileges she never had the authority to control. Others confessed they'd been uncomfortable with her tactics for months but didn't know how to push back. Her deception had run deep. Watching the patrol cars disappear with her in the back seat, I knew Emily had orchestrated this perfectly. She let Pam expose herself, ensuring every threat, every lie, every escalation was on record. But the way Emily kept reviewing her notes, her insistence on gathering every scrap of evidence, told me she wasn't finished yet. Pam might be gone, but this felt like only the first layer of something bigger. Alan Harper was already one step ahead of the crowd. While the community's attention was still glued to Pam's arrest at the lake, I spotted him in the community center, hurriedly sweeping files, laptops, and hard drives into a box. It was clear he had no intention of sticking around once Pam fell. Emily watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable, but I could tell she had been waiting for this move all along. Pam's downfall had been the opening act, not the conclusion. Later, while securing Pam's belongings, I discovered an unlabeled USB drive in her jacket pocket. When I examined it that evening, my stomach tightened. One of the folders bore my name. By Monday, everything felt different. At the station, Emily arrived in uniform. The shift was startling. Gone was the relaxed neighbor I'd grown used to. At the cabin in her place stood a confident, methodical officer moving through evidence protocols like it was second nature. Watching her work made me realize how little I had understood about her professional world. Then Harper walked into the station. He carried a USB drive of his own and marched in with the bravado of a man convinced he was about to deliver a fatal blow. He claimed he had proof of Emily's misconduct, documents that would expose her as unfit for law enforcement. His performance was theatrical, but beneath the bluster I saw desperation. He wasn't launching an attack from a position of strength. He was gambling on a last chance to protect himself. The drive was organized almost too neatly, folders labeled Emily Evidence, with staged documents meant to smear her reputation. But when the digital forensics team dug deeper, the trap backfired spectacularly. Hidden partitions revealed Harper's real operations: fake business registrations, fraudulent HOA filings, and ledgers tracking payments siphoned from unsuspecting residents. In his attempt to frame Emily, he had handed investigators the blueprint of his own crimes. The scale was staggering. This wasn't just about our lakeside community. His files detailed a network of sham HOAs stretching across multiple towns, all targeting retirement neighborhoods and rural homeowners. Residents thought they were paying routine fees. In reality, they were funding Harper and Pam's con. As I reviewed the evidence, I couldn't help comparing it to old fraud cases I'd seen during my years in automotive work of phony maintenance records, false insurance claims. The tactics were familiar, but Harper's operation was far more elaborate. He built convincing paperwork, complete with seals, QR codes, and bylaws that looked official at first glance but collapsed under real legal scrutiny. It was clear now why Emily's pointed legal questions had rattled both him and Pam. My earlier photograph of the lakeside sign proved invaluable. Cross-checking the ID numbers against state property databases showed that Pam's claims of HOA jurisdiction were completely fabricated. Even small details like vehicle registration numbers reflected in Harper's surveillance photos became crucial leads, linking his shell companies across multiple states. Harper's downfall was sealed not just by his fraud, but by his arrogance. He assumed fake evidence would pass unchallenged, forgetting that law enforcement had far sharper tools at their disposal. Every document he forged, every file he created, became another nail in his own coffin. The investigation widened quickly. Other jurisdictions came forward with nearly identical complaints of residents bullied by fake HOAs, coerced into paying fees under threats of lost access or legal action. What began as a neighborhood dispute was unraveling into a multi-state fraud case, with possible federal charges looming. And then came the call that shifted everything. Emily received word from the state parks department. Whatever they had uncovered, it was serious enough to warrant a public meeting with officials, the press, and the entire community. Emily ended the call with a look of quiet triumph. "Tomorrow," she said, closing her laptop, "Pam's about to find out what real authority looks like." By Wednesday morning, media vans lined the roads. State officials set up displays of authentic survey maps and legal records. Residents gathered, buzzing with a mix of dread and anticipation. Emily stood at the front, uniform crisp, her role no longer a secret to anyone. The state representative began the presentation by unveiling certified survey maps. Every claim Pam had made about jurisdiction, maintenance responsibilities, lake access was exposed as fiction. All of it, every square foot of shared land and water, was state park property. No private HOA had ever existed here in any legal capacity. The overgrown vegetation that had hidden the original state park signage suddenly seemed symbolic of truth buried beneath layers of deception. As the facts were laid bare, I glanced at Pam. For the first time, her expression wasn't smug or commanding, it was stunned. She had built her empire on land that was never hers to control, and the truth was finally crashing down on her in front of everyone she had deceived. Pam continued to protest from where officers held her, but the truth was beyond dispute. Official records laid bare the reality of every dollar she had collected, every rule she had enforced, every threat she had made was built on authority she had never possessed. The state representative's words cut through the noise with calm precision. "Ma'am, you've been running an unauthorized fee collection scheme on state park property while falsely claiming management authority." The weight of that statement tripled through the crowd. Residents realized, many for the first time, that they had poured thousands of dollars into the pockets of someone who had no more legitimacy than a stranger off the street. The fallout was immense. Her fraud had crossed state lines, triggering federal charges on top of her local arrest. Emily and I stepped forward with the evidence we had gathered over weeks, records of harassment, intimidation, and property sabotage, all documented in meticulous detail. Piece by piece, it revealed the pattern of vehicles tampered with, mail stolen, surveillance conducted, and finally, threats with weapons. Pam's so-called authority had been maintained through fear, not law. The prosecutors wasted no time. Fraud, extortion, conspiracy, weapons violations, obstruction of both Pam and Harper now faced a mountain of charges, the kind that came with decades in prison. Their operation was too widespread, too systematic, to be treated as anything less than a federal case. Other victims in distant states, who had suffered under the same fraudulent HOA model, would finally see justice too. For our neighbors, the numbers were sobering. Collectively, they had been robbed of tens of thousands of dollars. Restitution would return the money in time, but the emotional toll of the stress, the fear, the feeling of being trapped would linger longer. Many admitted they had known something about Pam's behavior felt wrong, but her claims of official authority had kept them silent. That silence shattered the moment crews arrived to strip down Pam's false HOA signs. Bolts hit the dock with a sharp clang as the fraudulent symbols of her rule came down. Watching those signs dismantled felt like shackles being removed at the end of her manufactured power. Pam's final moments of freedom were consumed by denial. As she was escorted for federal booking, she still shouted that her management had been legitimate, clinging to lies even as her empire crumbled. Nearby, Harper's papers scattered in the wind, a fitting image of their conspiracy literally disintegrating. Emily's role in all this became crystal clear to everyone. Her steady documentation, her patience in building a case strong enough for prosecution, and her deliberate strategy of exposing Pam publicly. It had all been intentional. None of it had been chance. She had set the stage for Pam to collapse under the weight of her own lies. The media coverage spread quickly, turning Pam's downfall into a cautionary tale. Reports explained how residents could confirm whether an HOA was legitimate and what red flags pointed to fraud. That publicity gave other communities a chance to recognize they too might be victims. Investigators soon confirmed Ida Harper's files suggested dozens of neighborhoods across multiple states had been targeted. New victims were already coming forward. Walking among the crowd after the announcements, I overheard my neighbors finally speaking openly about the intimidation they had endured, stories they had once been too afraid to share. Breaking that silence had required Emily's persistence, her willingness to endure harassment until Pam pushed herself past the point of no return. When it was over, our community could finally breathe. Pam's empire had been built on deception, intimidation, and greed, but in the end, the truth had unraveled it completely. The state had reclaimed its land. The law had reasserted real authority, and the lake was finally free from her shadow. 6 weeks after her arrest, the transformation was undeniable. Where fear had once ruled, peace had returned. Families gathered by the water without worrying about violations. Children played along the shoreline, parents relaxed in lawn chairs, and the community began to feel whole again. Restitution arrived faster than anyone expected. Pam and Harper's assets were liquidated, and residents received back the money they had lost. The federal courts moved efficiently. Both conspirators were sentenced to long prison terms, their futures consumed by the very system they had tried to exploit. Neither of them would ever be allowed to contact us again. On a personal level, the change was just as real. My garage picked up more business than ever, neighbors choosing to support someone they now trusted. After years of manipulation, they valued honesty above all else, and they saw that in my work. Meanwhile, the state park resumed proper oversight of the area. Real maintenance, clear rules, and fair management replaced Pam's fabricated authority. Neighbors began working together voluntarily, organizing activities and keeping shared spaces tidy without fear or coercion. The difference between genuine cooperation and forced compliance was striking. Emily returned to her regular duties, but kept our cabin as her home, balancing her professional world with the peace she had wanted in retirement. Her handling of the case had earned her respect among colleagues, who recognized the patience and discipline it had taken to let Pam expose herself rather than rushing to act too soon. Perhaps the most satisfying moment came when we recycled the remnants of Pam's fake authority, her bogus notices, threatening letters, and fraudulent fee slips. Watching them vanish into the recycling bin felt like erasing the last traces of her control from our lives. And just as quickly as Pam had divided us, the community began to stitch itself back together. With her gone, neighbors rediscovered how much stronger they were when they trusted each other instead of fearing a false authority. Neighbors who once kept their distance during the height of Pam's harassment campaign now stopped by regularly, openly sharing their own encounters with her intimidation tactics. Bonds that should have grown naturally years ago were finally forming, this time built on genuine friendship and mutual respect instead of shared fear of an overbearing leader. Through it all, Emily and I had grown closer as well. Our father-daughter connection had been tested by danger and strengthened through perseverance. Watching her shift so seamlessly from her professional law enforcement role to relaxed family time gave me an even deeper appreciation for her character and her steady commitment to justice. Our evening talks often drifted into stories from her career, things she'd never opened up about before, adding new depth to our relationship. The wider community also began to flourish. Property values rebounded quickly once buyers learned Pam's fabricated HOA and her extortion tactics were permanently gone. Realtors no longer had to warn about aggressive enforcement or illegitimate authority figures, and could once again market our lakeside neighborhood for what it truly was, a peaceful retirement destination. The natural beauty and leisure activities that had first drawn us here were finally available without fear of retaliation. State park officials installed proper signage and clear information about real rules and regulations. The difference was stark. Legitimate authority relied on transparency and fairness, not threats and confusion. Residents could finally understand their rights without the constant dread of arbitrary punishment. Emily's ability to navigate multiple roles as a law officer, neighbor, family while remaining true to herself impressed me more than ever. The way she had handled Pam required courage, professionalism, and strategy. Her quiet competence throughout the ordeal revealed strengths I had previously underestimated. At the local convenience store, the community found a new hub. Residents gathered by the coffee station, swapping updates on the ongoing federal investigation and celebrating each step of justice. The store manager even kept newspaper clippings pinned up, turning it into an unofficial bulletin board of progress. These casual conversations helped neighbors process the betrayal they had endured. Meanwhile, investigators kept uncovering more evidence. Pam and Alan's fraud stretched across several states, revealing a systematic scheme targeting retirees for years. Our community's ordeal turned out to be only one chapter in a much larger story, and the publicity gave countless other victims the courage to come forward. As I strolled through the neighborhood in the evenings, I often noticed scenes that would have been impossible under Pam's shadow. Families held cookouts, kids pedaled their bikes freely, and neighbors mingled across property lines without hesitation. Without her constant surveillance and manufactured rules, natural community life had returned almost overnight. Looking back, it became clear that Pam's elaborate scheme collapsed under the weight of her own desperation. Every criminal act meant to keep her in control only accelerated her downfall. We had moved here for peace and quiet, never expecting to face something like this. But sometimes, standing up to false authority is the only way to protect what's real. The ending wasn't dramatic, no explosive confrontation, no cinematic moment. It was quieter, more meaningful, a neighborhood breathing freely again. Pam had claimed to be the law, wielding fear as her weapon, and for a time, many believed her. But the true authority had been present all along, embodied in Emily's steady resolve and calm professionalism. No theatrics, just truth, delivered firmly. And with that, the balance of power shifted back where it belonged. Maybe the biggest lesson is this: those who shout the loudest about rules are often the ones most afraid of being held accountable themselves.